Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. My name is Egberto Willis. I'm honored to be with Dr. Matt Grossmann, who's the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research and also an associate professor of political science at Michigan State University, as well as a fellow at the Niskanen Center. Welcome aboard, Dr. Matt Grossmann, author of Red States Blues. I love the name, Red States Blues. How are you doing this morning?
Doing well. Good to be with you.
Excellent. Before we get started, let's put your book aside. Let's put the theme of your book aside. And I just want to ask a question about what happened yesterday. What are your thoughts implicitly?
Well, it is certainly momentous to see the House moving forward with impeachment after a long period of sort of build-up to what looked like nothing happening. We saw a relatively instant switch on the part of the Democratic leadership in response to the new allegations surrounding Ukraine. Still seems unlikely that Donald Trump will be removed from office before the next year's election, but it will certainly be interesting to see. I actually got to be in the Senate chamber for Bill Clinton's trial in the 90s. So it's also bringing back memories of that to me.
It almost seems like a switch turned and they got some information they weren't expecting that none of us yet know, because suddenly it seems like they got a whole lot of spine.
They did. I mean, I think it is helpful to have a new set of allegations to kind of get people off the idea that this is the same set of things that we've been discussing for the last few years. So it could be that. It also seemed to strike a chord with the national security establishment in particular. And so it could be that is what moved some of those members over.
Well, that's interesting. Just wanted to hear your point of view of that. Anyhow, Red State Blues, the not so special interests artists of the possible and campaigns and elections. Amazing. Let me ask you a few questions first about why you wrote the book. Most people are of the belief that all these states are now, too many states are now under control of Republicans, and they did a good job of doing it. I think the premise of your book is, so what?
Yeah, I mean, Republicans moved from control of only 3 states in the early 1990s to 26 as of last year. So there was sort of an opportunity to say, what have they accomplished with all of that political control? It's clear that they've been good at staying in power over an extended period. And some of that did involve policies like redistricting and trying to defund unions and trial lawyers. So some of those efforts clearly had bore fruit in terms of staying in power, but they, of course, professed an ideological agenda for smaller government, for lower taxes, for social traditionalism, all kinds of things that we might expect they had an opportunity to achieve with their high degree of power. And the main message is that they really didn't make it very far in terms of trying to change the structure of government in order to reduce its size, in order to roll back social liberalism, or really kind of any of their professed policy agenda items. And what they did pass tended to have not very large effects on the ground. So abortion and gun policies changed in all of the states that they controlled, but abortion rates and gun ownership rates really were not affected by Republican control of state government.
I wrote a post several times that if you really wanted the effects of Republican policies, you should try living in a blue state, because you've made a very important mention on things like abortions. It's not only abortions, but marriages, all the things that these guys look at from what they consider moral standpoints, or the things being lived in the blue states, almost see it stating that more progressive policies lead to the moral outcomes they're looking for? I don't know, but I mean, if you look at the data, it seems like that is what it says. Now,
yeah, I would say Republicans have a little bit of response, which is, the things that Democrats claim to care about are often worse, and it seemed to be worse in blue states. Things like inequality, for example, and so they have some ways to respond.
Actually, that is a pretty good observation. Look at New York City, right? New York City is one of the cities with the largest income and wealth disparity. So, I mean, touche. I guess it's always dependent on from what point of view you're looking at something that actually makes sense. Now, if you were to look at what the biggest success is for, let's say, Republican or conservative control in any state, what would you consider that to be?
Well, I think I guess it depends on how you define success. But one measure
success means success meaning relative to the policies you espound for.
Yeah, I think for one big thing that should be considered a success from the conservative point of view is blocking the expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act in 14 states. That's the largest state program. It has direct effects on the ground, and so from the perspective of the conservatives' goals, that should be viewed as a success. On the other hand, if you look at the trend is that 36 states did expand Medicaid, so overall policy in that area was still moving in a liberal direction under conservative control of the states. If we want to look at conservative effects across states, I think the biggest success story for them would be charter schools and vouchers, the movement toward educational choice, which occurred in Democratic states as well as Republican states, and sort of moved policy rightward on education policy.
You mentioned charter school, and I kind of have that sort of brings up a bad taste in my mouth all of the times, because interestingly, what you've also noticed is that right here in blue states or states controlled by progressives, charter schools are also things that are pushed by progressives many a time, specifically in places like inner cities, etc. And we know what the outcomes generally are. So if I were to take your book on when you make the statement that look at the types of policies that change in red states, how much different are they from let's say in the liberal state? It seems to me that we coalesce in one place, and I'm just going to throw this out at you. Ultimately, both parties work for the benefit of the specific success of corporations, the socialization of corporations, if you will.
Well, I don't know if all the patterns fit that mold. I think there has been a lot of bipartisanship, to your point, on charter schools and vouchers. Another area where states have moved together is criminal justice, where all states kind of locked them up and threw away the key to start. And then nearly all states have actually sort of started to see a little bit of a liberalization of criminal justice policy to move away from mass incarceration during the last 10 years. Even under the Trump administration, which is a little bit surprising. So I don't think all of those trends are explainable by corporate power. But one of the things you do notice is that these local interest groups in the state still matter. And even when it comes to, say, expanding liberal policies, like under the Medicaid expansion that we just talked about, one of the big successes or indicators of whether that succeeded was whether the local hospitals were strongly in favor and had enough power to move Republican governors to support Medicaid expansion. So even when it comes to ostensibly liberal policies, the support from local corporate actors certainly matters.
I don't recall in the book, did you examine how that applied to South Carolina at all?
In South Carolina?
Yeah.
There's not Medicaid expansion in particular.
They didn't. It's somehow the pressure, from what I had understand up to a few months ago. I had another interviewee. It hadn't been very successful in doing that. So
there are a lot of places where they had lots of the corporate community together and still were unable to pass that. You also see that in transportation funding, where often the Chamber of Commerce is in favor of moving, more taxes and more spending on roads, and they're not able to achieve that. There's also, you bring up South Carolina, there still is a Southern exceptionalism in the U.S. where these Southern states started, they were quite conservative under Democrats. They're also quite conservative under Republicans. And they have the smallest state governments. They're the slowest to move in lots of different policy areas. And so there's a lot of maps of American politics and policymaking where the South still stands out.
And amazingly, it shows in quite a bit, right? I mean, a little bit off your book. This isn't mentioned in your book, but I want your opinion because, again, you're a political science expert. All the data shows that conservative states, from an educational standpoint, from a wealth standpoint, from a dependency standpoint, fares much worse than the vast majority of blue states. Why isn't that more of an issue? Why isn't that something that is promoted more to these people so that they, in fact, would realize that just maybe their policies are incorrect?
Well, I didn't find a whole lot of relationship between Republican or Democratic control of the states and those kinds of outcomes. You certainly can see a lot of associations. So, like we said, we can say right now Republican states have higher divorce, all kinds of family outcomes that seem inconsistent with their professed views. Democratic states have
income inequality.
Inequality. They have some difficulties that are inconsistent with their professed views. But that doesn't mean that it was state party control that caused those differences.
So you're changing causality with what's actually
So we don't, for example, the southern states are just behind in lots of those indicators, and they were behind when they were controlled by Democrats, and they're still behind when they're controlled by Republicans. And so when we try to look at, did a change in leadership, say the election of a Democratic governor instead of a Republican governor, or vice versa, did that change those indicators over time? We just don't find as much evidence that it did.
So that would change quite a bit of narrative here. Let me see if I understand exactly what you're saying. You're saying that in as much as the statement may be true, causality may have nothing to do with ideology?
Well, it's just that there are certain states that are going to be high and low on various indicators, and most of that is very stable over time and is true under Democratic and Republican control of those states. And so,
go ahead.
Once you try to differentiate, let's say, when Michigan has had a Republican governor versus when it has had a Democratic governor, do we see changes associated with that change in leadership? We just don't find as much evidence that these underlying social indicators move with the political control of the states.
But you said political control, not ideological control, because and I want to clarify this, is maybe correct myself here. Earlier, I think you stated that even the southern states have always been conservative states, whether under Democratic control or Republican control.
Policy.
Oh, right. Actually, under conservative they've always been conservative, irrespective of the party.
Yes.
Now, the question then is, it's not necessarily political control. Is there have you seen an ideological component versus a political component for the success of any particular state?
You can see that in individual policies. So, for example, we talked about Medicaid expansion has clear effects on things like inequality, on health bankruptcy, racial inequality, lots of differences. And so you can show that effect. But when you kind of add it all up and you say, did the states fare better under Republican control or Democratic control? You see less evidence. And part of the reason for that is that the states didn't move overwhelmingly liberal or overwhelmingly conservative under Republican or Democratic control.
That makes a lot of sense. That clarifies quite a bit. Appreciate that. Now, what can liberals learn? Because I think conservatives in general are much more are much better at messaging, are much more effective at reaching people. I mean, you can look at books, the Kansas book, I don't remember the full name of it, and all these different books that shows you that they are better at touching to the carnality of people. What can liberals do to get there in the right manner?
Well, I guess I would clarify that conservatives are better at selling a broad ideological message. That doesn't mean liberals have no strengths. One of their strengths is in kind of making the debate about individual policy issues. So Americans tend to hold conservative attitudes about the size and scope of government in general, but they hold very liberal attitudes when we start to talk about specific policy issues like education, like healthcare, like criminal justice, anything. And so it's often actually liberals are sort of better off in any individual policy debate and kind of narrowing it and making it just about, should we help these folks who are in need right now? Should we try to punish these bad actors? They tend to win those debates on individual policy grounds. It's just that they never kind of advance the more generic argument that government can solve problems, that it's the role of government to try to redistribute income from the rich to the poor, that social change can be good, that diversification is a good trend. We don't hear those kind of in general terms, and so Americans continue to hold these kind of broad conservative attitudes, even though they really don't match their individual policy opinions. So that is good for conservatives in elections, I would say, but bad for conservatives in governing. So once they get into power and they say, okay, you wanted small governments and now we're going to reduce school funding, that is extremely unpopular. Now we're going to take away health benefits from people who currently receive them, also very unpopular. So that is kind of the conservative difficulty. I think the liberal difficulty is adding up all of these individual policies, all of these social groups that are part of the Democratic coalition, and saying, we actually have a broader vision to sell you on the role of government in society. They've never succeeded in doing that.
Now, so what would you consider the socioeconomic impact of where we are right now? The socioeconomic impact of exactly what you've just said, right? One group knows how to govern, the other group does not necessarily know how to put it into practice. What is the outcome of that reality?
Well, I think the good news for liberals is that we have these liberalizing trends in public policy. Government tends to take on new problems over time. It tends to spend more. It tends to regulate more. But it does so slowly and maybe not enough to counteract the forces that liberals are trying to solve. So take climate change, for example. If you look at the action in the states, it's actually been mostly to try to encourage alternative energy, for example. But obviously, it's been nowhere near large enough to actually move the needle on climate change. So liberals' difficulty is they can win these kind of little incremental battles pretty regularly, but maybe not enough to kind of change these broad outcomes that they are trying to address. Minimum wage, for example. The direction in the states is actually toward a higher minimum wage, but it's nowhere near enough to address rising economic inequality. Now, we do get a chance to see what will happen now because Democrats had their best election in a while last year. And so we have 6 new states that are fully Democratic controlled, and they are moving quite a bit. New Mexico, for example, has increased its budget pretty considerably by about 10% in the first year, is addressing all kinds of social and economic
medical,
Yeah. And so there is a chance to see whether the new Democratic majorities might be able to move faster than either set of states has in the past.
Well, let me tell you what I'm really impressed with you, Professor. There are several times I pretty much try to get specific on saying, oh, the left has this so right and the wrong has this, the right has this so wrong. And you never once took that on. I mean, that is what I call a researcher. I really appreciate that, and that makes what I do quite a bit better because it forces me to look at things in a complete way. So I want to thank you for doing that. Now, what are Democratic controlled states likely to pass when we come on board? I'm making the assumption right now that we're going to get quite a few more states that are going to flip in this next election. I think I could be all wrong, but I have a hunch based on where I see things going, and this is before this impeachment talk, that there's going to be a very good election for Democrats in 2020. Assuming that I'm right, what are those things that you think will get done in immediacy?
Well, so sorry, I can't assume, but then back to
I know.
electoral side for a moment. I do think it's worth pointing out Democrats had a great election last year, but they still really only moved back in the states about to the level they were before the 2014 election. They didn't come close to remaking their gains in 2010. And some of the places, I mean, Republican gains.
You mean 26, right? 6.
Yeah. And so they suffered a huge loss in 2010 that they've not anywhere near come back to retaining. And some of that is pretty long term, right? It's very difficult to see them regaining control of a state like Oklahoma or South Dakota, where they used to be regularly competitive and now they're not competitive at all. So some of the change in the states might be permanent and more difficult to counteract with electoral outcomes. The other thing is that election gains tend to come when the party is out of the presidency, right? So Republicans made their big gains under Barack Obama. Democrats are making their big gains under Donald Trump. And that makes it difficult policy-wise to move things in your direction, right? If Republicans made gains when the federal government was passing Obamacare and passing the stimulus package, it was more difficult for them, just as under Democratic control in the states, they're facing an opposed administration under Donald Trump. So the difficulty is kind of, can you get both the presidency and control of the states at the same time? That hasn't happened lately. And so it's been difficult for either party to make big policy moves at both the federal and state level at the same time. In terms of what they're passing, it is pretty across the board. It is not limited to social issues, although you do see changes in abortion laws, gun laws, environmental laws. You also see a lot of pure economic change, even changes in taxes, changes in regulation. And so I think Democrats just have a very long list of policies that they're trying to pass, a lot of constituencies that they are trying to satisfy. And it's difficult to do that all at once, but they are working their way down the list.
Now, and my question again is, do you think this is something that they can be successful at?
I think they certainly will move some policies incrementally leftward with Democratic control. The difficulty has been, are those policies big enough to actually change outcomes on the ground? And they have not been. So, for example, Democrats have not passed universal health care in any state. They have not passed a environmental program on par with the Green New Deal or anything to address climate change in the states. But they have expanded healthcare coverage in the states. They have expanded alternative energy in the states. So they will be successful, I think, at continuing that kind of incremental moves leftward. The question is whether that will actually change outcomes on the ground.
The name of the book, Red State Blues: How the Conservative Revolution Stalled in States. For those of you who follow Politics Done Right, you know I loved the book because actually, look, I mean, you're right. I hate to use the word right down the middle, but this is a book that I think every single American citizen, whether Republican, Democrat, whether liberal, conservative, I think it's important that you read this book because it will give you a whole lot of perspective. It won't only give you a whole lot of perspective, it'll make you pragmatic, and it'll also take a little bite away from that twinge that you have. Like, I tried to move this professor all the way. He didn't bite. Look, let me tell you, Professor, it's been my honor to have you on Politics Done Right. I want to thank you for a very well-written book. I think it's an important book, more so than probably most just looking at the name would think. And I think it's a damn good job. And we need more, what I'd call straight talking out of a book like this, that even a very progressive person can look at and say, my God, that was a fair book. And I think it's something everybody can see. Dr. Matt Grossmann, any closing words you want to have before we close out?
Well, thanks so much. I just hope that the liberal audience will understand that from the conservative perspective, they passed a whole bunch in the states, but they've kind of been unable to change the size and scope of government overall. And so while liberals can be disappointed that they don't get to pass more of the things that they want to pass, I think it is helpful to understand kind of the perspective of the other side and why both sides may think that they're kind of losing this epic battle in American politics.
Dr. Matt Grossmann, author of Red State Blues, How the Conservative Revolution Stalled in the United States, Director of Institute of Public Policy and Social Research, and Associate Professor at Michigan State University. It was my pleasure to have you on Politics Done Right, and you have a wonderful rest of your writing career.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.